Hi, everybody. I am very honored to have Darin Gaub here today. Darin, would you tell everybody quickly a little bit about yourself before we jump into today's interview?
Hey, sure, Michael. Thanks for having me on. I'm a retired Army lieutenant colonel. My specialty was aviation, flying helicopters. But besides that, my general skill set took me towards the global geopolitical realm. So basically, I play global chess all the time, and co-founder of Restore Liberty alongside Blaine Holt, and do a lot of other work in the media.
Wonderful. We need that kind of wisdom right now. So, on the surface, after the amazing election a few weeks ago, it seems like things are on the upswing in America. Would you agree? Do we need more nuance to that answer? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's always nuance to add to anything, but let's start out by saying very thrilled with the win, of course,
Mhm.
with the shift away from the really extreme positions of, to simplify, the left, of course, and to go from there. There's a lot of work to do, though. That's the nuanced part. Is a cabinet, a president can't fix things on their own, and they're going to continue to stay under duress and under attack from the globalists, the so-called elite who aren't elite at all, the DC power centers, for the entire 4 years of his administration again. So they haven't given up, and we can't either. And what we need to do at this point is, the celebration piece of any of this should be over. We have to double down on our messaging, double down on truth, get behind a loyalty to the principles of the Constitution and those kinds of things. And what does it look like, though, for these globalists and these types of people to fight against this administration? Well, right now it looks like they're trying to handcuff Trump to a war that keeps expanding, that has no purpose to expand, no strategy behind it. So that's just one thing. There are many others. So I'm extremely optimistic for the future, at least over the next 4 years, and what can be done. But I'm realistic towards how much they're going to get attacked by people from, frankly, all over the globe.
Right. Well, let's talk about the threat of World War III that seems to be looming on the horizon. If you had to suggest what you think may be happening between now and when Trump takes office, even worst case scenario, what does that look like?
Well, first thing I would do is I'd point you to the Substack where I wrote that whole thing out. Uh,
What is what is that for my readers and listeners? Where can they go?
DarinGaub.substack.com. Um, or just look up Substack and my name, and it's the only one there. But it's an article basically I wrote 2 years ago. I sat on it for a while. I tweaked the scenario some as we got closer to the election, when a landslide of the nature that we saw was obviously about to take effect. And about a week before the election, I published that article and just talked about how the actual most dangerous time for this nation is right around the corner. And that corner was the turn around from a Trump victory between that and the Trump inauguration. And all of that it means as far as the administration in DC is concerned, many of the state legislatures, and you can trickle down throughout politics, this right shift. And the whole message was that if these people see themselves losing, they're going to create something that is going to be a distraction, and a massive enough distraction that it could potentially derail an administration for quite some time. And what's one of the greatest ways to do that is to, blow up a war rather than find a strategy to end it. They're finding a strategy to expand it for no real purpose at this point either. So I think a lot of people are starting to realize, at least the part that I saw 2 years ago, which is a result of me playing global strategies for since I was 16 years old, um, was that they would attempt to do this. It's not, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a perfect scenario the way I wrote it out in my Substack, but the greater point is, if you can handcuff Trump and this administration to a much bigger conflagration, they're not going to necessarily have the time to get at the priorities and the mandate that Americans have sent them.
What sounds a little bit, if I'm understanding you correctly, as if this would handcuff him from being able to pursue his agenda. But on the other
Mhm.
hand, it also seems like we may very well be going into a hot nuclear war. Do you anticipate that is a possibility?
Never write off anything 100%, but I find the nuclear aspect of this really truly the least likely. Uh, Nuclear weapons have become the leverage of choice, not necessarily the application of choice, because and frankly that would change the makeup of the globe so much that nobody wants to be the one to start that. Now, who would most likely be a one to even attempt that? It's not necessarily Russia and Ukraine. It would be more of a Iran against Israel scenario, because that's just the kind of regime Iran is. There is a level of realpolitik and rationality to how Putin acts. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's not a thug. We know that. We know he's a dictator, but he's dealing with the reality largely of his own making. That he knows that a nuclear exchange of some sort changes the equation so much that it would actually risk everything he thinks he's fighting for.
You brought up
So,
Iran. Do you see other threats coming from the Middle East during this very sensitive period? And beyond that, what might other threats be maybe even an assassination attempt on Trump? What are some of the other threats besides even Iran as well?
well, let's just label the easy quad arc of evil right now, which is Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Yeah, that's the easy one to see right now. And then, of course, when you step out another level from that, it's all those who are there trying to influence. So I see the clear and easy one is obviously at this point, what do you do with Ukraine, and what is that? How does that turn? And does it turn in the first place? It's stagnant, or mostly stagnant, and has been for a long time. Iran attacking Israel again, very possible. However, they failed massively twice and have been embarrassed twice. And they're actually a regime on the edge of a cliff. And the people of Iran have a chance to actually change that there. So, although that would be a good news story, it would certainly cause a certain amount of turbulence in Iran and increase a certain amount of risk too, because a regime could lash out at that point if they see themselves losing power. So, there's a possibility for the Iranian mullahs saying, well, this is going south fast. This is the time for us to do what we've always said and do something against Israel, regardless of what that looks like. Um, Now, North Korea is North Korea. It's sort of that crazy kid in the corner that you can never totally predict, but in some ways, you just know they're going to be crazy. So North Korea's been launching stuff at South Korea into the ocean specifically for years, and they do that mostly to get concessions. And I don't doubt that they would fail to continue to do that. Maybe bigger missiles, maybe longer ranges, maybe bigger payloads, but the goal is not necessarily to threaten the outside world so much or anything else. It's to continue to get those concessions. The biggest threat on the Korean Peninsula has always been South Korea going north, not North Korea coming south. So I find that particular scenario not very likely. Uh, but you can continue to see North Korea be engaged with the other members of that arc of evil. China, though, that's really the concern. The pivot to China is a big deal for the U.S. Intelligence architectures and military, and it's the right pivot to make because it's the ideology of communism that is continuing to infiltrate and invade our colleges that's the biggest threat, not China invading Taiwan or some scenario like that. They're not really all that capable of doing it. So there's going to be a lot of threats leveled against America or America's allies. Some of them are realistic, potentially. Some of them are not as realistic, but those threats are designed to distract us from the mission we need to do. Now, let's paint a worst case scenario here, though. Let's just say that for some reason we end up embroiled in a conflict that takes a good chunk of our military away to do something. And it doesn't even have to have any strategic real value to us whatsoever. Just by drawing away our military, you've accomplished the mission of potentially of whoever's trying to get us to do that. What's the military now not doing? Well, the military is not now being used to assist in making sure that we clean up this massive illegal alien invasion that's happened over the last 4 years because those assets have been tied up elsewhere. And that to me is the greatest threat to the homeland is all of those people who've come across this border, terrorists, drug dealers, thugs, and you can put a label on all those kinds of things. And that's the real threat we need to deal with first. And that's what our military, our Department of Justice, our Treasury, our FBI, all those need to focus on that first. An eye to the foreign policy, an eye to the foreign wars. But none of those wars need to happen or expand beyond what they're at now. Most of them simply just need to end, and they can if we stop playing this game with places like Iran and Moscow and even our support to Ukraine and settle these things right.
Right. Well, it sounds like we have multiple things that we are dealing with at once. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to something you mentioned earlier. You were talking about the contagion essentially from the communist specter that's already infiltrated so much of the zeitgeist, especially the colleges, but I would say it's even earlier than that in
Yeah.
schools, K through 12, maybe even preschool. Part of what happened here when it came to the victory is it seems to me it shows a huge disgust, a revolt culturally against these ideas, what are commonly lumped together in wokeism. Let's talk about that for just a moment. Do you think that this is showing the end of wokeism, that we're turning a corner of that chapter in our nation's history, or do you see that these forces become even more entrenched because they're under fire?
Both. Yeah, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not just playing the lawyer game. Um, Frankly, I think it's a turn, and it's the beginning of a long turn that has to get us away from this. And so we just have to be prepared for it. It's not going to change overnight, and it didn't get here overnight either. So that's one of the major concerns is that we let off again on the gas instead of flooring it and making sure that we get around this corner even faster. I agree with you that what you saw was a response to the unbridled wokeism across this nation in every agency, in every school, and everywhere you're looking. It's like, wow, the exposure of the evil caused a reaction in the American population. And even if it wasn't always the loudest, yeah, clearly based on election results, it was pretty effective. Um, but it will also mean that these same people who've managed to get themselves in positions of influence and power and oversight are going to dig in even harder and make sure that they cannot be taken out. I mean, look at what's going on in our schools. It's still the same garbage. And that's because of school boards and teachers buying off on the ideologies of wokeism and thinking it's something other than that, other than what it's not. Um, and so that's why I say both. Yes, they're going to dig in extremely hard. And yes, the election was largely a result, or in many cases, a result of that just visceral reaction to wokeism. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it was also just a reaction to the fact that nobody can afford gas or groceries.
Well, let's talk about that last part. I think it's very important. Do you see the economy going on the upswing with Trump in office? And if so, what would that look like?
Well, it already kind of started an upswing just by him getting, the most electoral votes. So now, I'm not the person who's going to stand up here and say purely that a presidential person getting elected is the deciding factor of an economy going up and down. In fact, the whole point is that that person being elected never should be the deciding factor on that. Nevertheless, we got to deal with the reality, which is policy matters. And when you combine the White House with the Congress and cabinet appointments, you're starting to see the opportunity to take our economy and free it up, which means the less the government's involved, the greater the economy accelerates. Mm-hmm. We're not trying to say complete hands off because people do dumb things. We know this. But we are saying that they're weighed down by the albatross of rules and regulations that can be removed. So if people in Congress, by the way, act like the Republicans they say they are, then you could see some good policies put in place. Unfortunately, a lot of Republicans have decided that underneath their red jacket is a blue colored undergarments, and they act that way. That can be harmful. We just have to make sure that we put the pressure on them, stick the quarter in the slot, and make them play our tune.
I don't disagree with that. So, Trump ran on this idea of making America great and going back to this America First mentality that unfortunately has been
Mhm.
absent for decades. Now that he has such an overwhelming victory, could you paint a picture of what, on a positive note, this could look like? Imagine we get out of this nightmarish next 2 months unscathed, at least largely. Could you paint a picture of a positive outcome, what the next 4 years could look like if we did go back to that mentality? And even more, what the next 8, 12, and on 15 years, 30 years, what could that look like?
Well, the first thing is that when we say make America great again, we're not saying that other countries and their citizens shouldn't have to take a second place to that. It means saying we want to make America great, but we understand that German people should fight for Germany. The Dutch should fight for, for their country. All these countries and their people, their government should do what's best for them. So it's not that kind of equation where make America great means everybody else is second fiddle or we're going to destroy you. No, that's not it. But what can this mentality lead to? Well, first of all, I say it leads to the ability to build a federal government that is limited to its within its constitutional boundaries correctly. So what does that look like practically on the ground? Well, if the promise comes through to disband the Department of Education, boom, immediately you know that we're on the road to success because that department is a complete waste of time and money. That's just one thing. Second, Department of Defense. Let's get back to funding things in the Department of Defense that have to do with national defense and not all the other stuff. That's a great way to do it. Let's shrink the federal government by a massive amount and get it back within the constitutional boundaries and push most of those responsibilities to where they're supposed to be under federalism, under the 10th Amendment, under the Ninth Amendment of the Constitution. Those things belong at the state level at the highest. And most often, really, we function at the municipal and county level. That's where the majority of decisions are made because that diffuses the risk of that wokeism or other bad policy from impacting the entire nation. So, the best way to make America great again is to diffuse the risk and make the decisions at the lowest level, at the community level. And so, make America great again, which means make the government small again.
I see. Well, speaking along those lines, this is your background in the military.
Mm.
What are your predictions for what Trump will do in terms of the infestation of DEI type policies, this rotting from the inside of the military that's been going on for the last 4, if not 8 years, maybe longer? Do you see that getting turned around under this administration?
I do, and because the Department of Defense is unique in the aspect of what executive orders and or commander in chief functions can do, and you add in someone like a Pete Hegseth, who good. Let's see what he can do with a great team around him to immediately implement those policies across the Department of Defense because the morale in the Department of Defense is extremely low because we're wasting our time on doing things that don't matter.
Mhm.
And we've gotten rid of merit-based promotions. We've gotten infested the wokeism throughout the ranks. We're not focusing on our readiness. We're sending our material and money over to Ukraine instead of building our own readiness within our own forces. And we've seen the results. I do believe with the right people in place, and that doesn't mean just Trump and just Hegseth. It means the greater team that are around them within the Department of Defense. They can turn that particular ship very quickly. It's a little different when you're dealing with Congress and Senate and Treasury and all these other different departments, but the Department of Defense can move a little bit faster. But it also means Congress has to defund those initiatives. Senate has to support it. Trump has to stand on the hill and say, I'm not moving from this because our nation needs it. Those kinds of things. I mean, I think it also means that people, I'll use myself for an example only. I'm standing here saying, you know what? If you're willing to buck the system and find different people to do things that can be done, I'll join the Hegseth team as Secretary of the Army. Pull me into DC, put me in. I don't want to have anything to do with Washington, D.C., but if my nation needs it and our people need it, I would do it. Now, the odds of that are less than 0.1%. But I think it's inherent upon all of us to recognize our skills and know that where we stand regarding the Constitution and our patriotism and our love of country and be willing to step into something that we may not want to do, but our nation needs us to do.
It seems like over the last 4 years, especially, that there have been many abuses of power that
Mm.
require accountability. I can name just a few of them, but let's say January 6th, the way those prisoners are being treated, accountability for the whole COVID thing, going back to the origins, going back to people like Anthony Fauci, going back to all those businesses that went under needlessly, to accountability when it comes to lawfare. I very much think that if we're going to turn this country around, we have to have accountability. Otherwise, bad people will be emboldened to continue to do bad things. Do you see that there will finally be some accountability in this nation under a Trump administration?
I do, and I'll add that in a quick, I hope so.
Yes.
uh, Day one, every January 6th person needs to be released. Pardon, full pardon, no consequence, move on.
Yes.
If they do something dumb later, so be it. But I think that's a huge message that needs to be heard. Number two, recall all the general officers who've been part of all this and who've since retired and put them in front of that board. And Trump is, I know he's seen the idea of this board. I know it's been circulating around of a board of accountability for all these different generals, and regardless of rank, frankly, that board needs to be made of generals, warrant officers, Department of the Army civilians, senior field grade officers like I was, who've been able to observe them from different perspectives and have different experiences. If that can happen, and these generals could truly be held accountable for the things that they did, and it starts with Milley in my mind, but you're quickly also approaching people like CQ Brown, the current chairman. Yeah, we're going to begin to make up potentially some of that bleeding that actually started with Obama cleaning out the ranks, looking for loyalists instead of war fighters. So I certainly hope so. And we haven't even begun to crack open all the things that happened underneath the bailiwick of the Department of Justice. Judges with no judgment who trash the Constitution. You can, I mean, that's a long discussion about all the different people. Fauci should be in prison. Hillary should have been in prison a long time ago. These kinds of things. I certainly hope to see some of that massive accountability, because the only fear in this nation should be the fear that evil has for the righteous folks like us who are going to come after them and say, justice is not what you think it is.
I couldn't agree more. One last question here. We were talking about wokeism and what I would call maybe the psyche of the American people, the zeitgeist, what's going on here. It seems to me that among all the other problems that we've had, probably the core problem here is that we have lost our way as a nation. And I think it does come down to accountability. A lot of bad things have happened for way too long, and bad people have gone unpunished. But at the same time, we were talking earlier about the spread of communism and bad ideas. And of course, they've gone after our children with these things. Do you think that there is a groundswell of change that is coming in the psyche and the hearts and minds of the American people based on this win? Something that can change our trajectory because we resume our moral compass. Is that coming, and is that possible for us to wake up from this delusion we've been under?
I certainly hope so. Again, of course, and I do think that there is a large part of that's already happened, and that's why we're here. So there's two aspects of that come to mind when you say that. First of all, from my role through being an ordained minister, I clearly see that there are a lot of people that have woken up to the evil, even though they may not necessarily fully understand its source and its purpose and how to get around that. But that will take time. But it means every pastor, every minister who knows and understands and believes the things of the Bible and understands how this nation is formed and what it's supposed to stand up for, and their job is to not just sit inside the walls. I believe that's a huge change we're already seeing in many churches who are saying, enough. We're not going to just sit back and watch this and not engage in civics and our society. That is going to take time. But if you never start, you never finish. It'll be a battle for the remainder of however long this earth lasts, and that's okay. We got to keep going with that. Second of all, what I truly believe is that we have a large part of our population that's stuck inside of Stockholm syndrome. And for those who don't know what that is, Stockholm syndrome means, that your captives start identifying with the captor and sympathizing with their captor and take their side because they're so reliant on their captor for their life, their livelihood, their food, their water. Pick the scenario. And so that looks like something on a national scale, like a large part of the population that says the federal government is my God and I worship it. And it's not realizing that it's actually your captor who is happy that you think that they are the provider to you for all things necessary to sustain and magnify and protect your life and your livelihoods. When that is unplugged and the reality becomes manifestly obvious right in front of them that they need to unplug from people need to get away from their captor and get back to realizing that our nation's built on communities, self-reliance, self-responsibility, and accountability to ourselves and those who are closest to us. Then we can break that bond, even if it's not necessarily at a spiritual level that I hopefully ultimately would love to see, even if it's just at the level of understanding psychologically that there is this bondage mentality that has to be broken, then we can get back to what we need to be truly doing and realize that the federal government is not supposed to be so big and so over encompassing that it's that who's sitting in the White House determines whether or not we can buy gas or food with this month's paycheck. That to me is the Stockholm syndrome. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great place to leave it. I want to thank you so much for your insights and your predictions, Darin. For people that want to follow your work, where can they go?
Well, they can search for me on Rumble. And I just have what I call a digital resume with all my interviews on Fox News, Newsmax, and various other outlets. I'm on Substack. Just type in Darin Gaub Substack. Guarantee it'll be the top of the list when you do a search. And then on X, the only social media that I have not been removed from is at least a second time, DL Gaub at DL Gaub, Gaub. So I'm on there, and every time I post something patriotic, I lose 5 followers. Oh, who knows who's following me?
Well, thank you so much for your bravery and your honesty and for really your patriotism. It means a lot. Thank you, Darin.
Yeah, same to you, Michael.